In this movie, I'll introduce you to a handful of interface and performance settings that I find to be very useful. To demonstrate the first of them, I'll go ahead and drag this image up and to the left so that you can see that we have this slight drop shadow under the image out here in this pasteboard. To better see it, I'll lighten up the interface by pressing Shift F2 a couple of times. And now you can see that drop shadow more clearly. Now, in my opinion, there's really no purpose behind the drop shadow behind the image, and you can get rid of it by pressing Control-K or Command-K on the Mac, and then pressing Control-2 or Command-2 to advance to the interface items. And notice that the border is set to drop shadow in both the standard screen mode and the full screen with menu mode. I personally go ahead and turn it off for full screen with menus and leave it on for the standard screen mode. And that way I can easily tell which mode I'm working with at any given moment in time. So now if I click OK, we'll still see the drop shadow because we're working in the standard mode. But if I press the F key to advance to the full screen mode, the drop shadow disappears. All right, I'm going to go ahead and press Shift F1 a couple of times to restore the dark interface. And I'll press Control-K or Command-K again to bring up preferences. And this time I'm going to switch forward to performance, which you can also get by pressing Control or Command-4. Notice our scratch disks down here. The idea is pretty much no matter what, whether you've got a ton of RAM installed on your machine or just a gig, say, at some point Photoshop is going to top out and it's going to have to cache some of the data that's associated with the open images, whether it's layers, smart objects, history, or what have you. It's going to have to store that information on a hard drive. And that's what's meant by scratch disks here. Now notice, by default, only the system level disk is selected. If your computer includes multiple disks, what you want to do is turn on your biggest disk, in my case that would be my D drive, and then go ahead and select that disk and nudge it up the stack, like so. So now Photoshop is going to hit the D drive first and then the C drive, and that's going to make for a speedier experience. Now, in order for this option to take effect, by the way, you're going to have to restart Photoshop. All right, now I'll go ahead and advance to cursors. And you can see that we have these precise cursor options, both for the painting cursors and for the other cursors. Another way to see those precise cursors, which usually involve a crosshair, is to just turn on the caps lock key anytime you're working in Photoshop. And then you turn caps lock off to switch back to the normal brush tip or the standard cursor. So I don't recommend you change these options up here. I do, however, recommend that you turn on Show Crosshair and Brush Tip so that you can see the center of your brush as you work. Next, I'm going to switch over to units and rulers, and I'll show you by default rulers are set to inches here in the States. I very much disapprove of that, by the way, and I'll show you why. I'm going to go ahead and click the OK button in order to accept the changes I've made so far. Let's say that I want to turn this horse into a Facebook cover, just by way of example. I know that a Facebook cover measures 851 pixels wide by 315 pixels tall. However, if I go up to the image menu and choose the canvas size command, let's say, in order to crop the image to exactly that size, by default, I'm going to see inches instead, which doesn't do me any good whatsoever. In fact, inches only come in handy, and this goes for millimeters as well. The only time that comes in handy is when you're printing an image, and you always see inches or millimeters in the image size dialog box and in the print dialog box, which are the two primary times you want to see those units of measure. Otherwise, we'd really want to switch over to pixels. And then, of course, I would go ahead and dial in those pixel values I was just telling you, and that would crop the image to that size. Now, if I click OK at this point, Photoshop's going to warn me that potentially something might get clipped inside my image. That only goes for the background. It doesn't affect the layers. So, in fact, I'm just hiding the pixels. I'm not cropping them for good. So I'll just go ahead and click on the Proceed button, and then I could press, let's say, Control-Alt-A or Command-Option-A on a Mac to select all the layers, and I could Control or Command drag them to a different location to establish the position of my horse inside of the new cover dimensions. Now I'll just go ahead and zoom in so I can see the image at 100%. Now this whole experience would be made a lot easier if I were working with pixels, which is the unit of measure I prefer inside Photoshop. And there's a couple of different ways to switch over to pixels. One is to go back to the Preferences dialog box. Another is just to bring up the rulers by pressing Command or Control-R, and then right-click on a ruler and choose the desired unit of measure. And notice you can switch back and forth as much as you like here. Or, just so you know everything that's available to you, you can go up to the Window menu and choose the Info command, and that will bring up the Info panel. And you'll see right here next to the X and Y values, you'll see this crosshair with a little tiny arrow below it. If you click on the crosshair, then you'll get this pop-up menu of units, and then you can go ahead and switch to pixels. And now, notice that changes the ruler. It's also going to change the default unit of measure inside the canvas size dialog box and elsewhere. All right, having made all my changes to the preference settings, the next thing you want to do to make sure those settings are saved is on a PC, go to the File menu and choose the Exit command. On a Mac, you would go to the Photoshop menu and choose the Quit command. Or, of course, you can press Control-Q or Command-Q on a Mac. And that takes care of the key preference settings here inside Photoshop.